Thanks again for coming this afternoon. We know that the holiday season is a very tight time, very busy, but we choose to take this time to kind of do a recap of the year in export control. And our presenter today will be Marcy Gentry. Marcy is a senior consultant that works for Export Solutions. Hopefully you all can see the screen. This is our standard disclaimer that our lawyers wrote. And fundamentally, it says that our job is to try to explain the regulations to you, but that the regulations themselves are the tiebreaker. They're really where you go to get the information that's official. Let's talk about how this webinar works. I know many of you have attended webinars before. You obviously have registered properly and gotten in on the webinar. You wouldn't be hearing me right now. We don't take live questions during these. We found that it's much better if you'll submit questions either through the question section, the question capability, or the chat line. And if you'll do that, I will be monitoring the questions. Marcy will be doing the presentations, and then we'll stop periodically and answer the questions. So make sure that you use the chat or the question and answer. And we will pause at various times, kind of in between sections, to answer questions. And we have time to do that at the end as well. And the main question everybody asks is, can we send you the slides? And the answer is yes. We will email the slides to everyone who attends, typically by sometime next week. It depends on how the week goes, how busy we are. And of course, as you know, you can use these slides for anyone internally within your company, but do not use them outside. They can't be sent to, published, sold, or used by anyone outside of your company. But anyone within your company, feel free to share them with them. We are also recording this webinar, and sometime next week that will be posted on our website. Talk about our next webinar. It'll be February the 13th. We call it the best webinar you'll ever attend about export control, and we say that because it's free. All of our webinars are free. This is one that we used in the past, and it is a general webinar about export control. I will be the presenter, Don Bueller, and if you have people in your company who are new to export control, or if you just want a brief reminder of what export control is all about, then please attend that session. And you can see there where to register. There's a link. There's my picture and Marcy's picture. I'll be turning it over to Marcy in a minute. Okay, one more thing. We decided to do a brain teaser today. As you know, today is December the 12th, 2012, or 12/12/12. So here's your brain teaser. If you're 40 years old today, how old will you be the next time the date repeats the same three numbers? If you know the answer, send it to me via chat, and at the end we'll reveal who got the question right. And now I'll turn it over to Marcy Gentry. Marcy, take it away.
Thanks, Don. So going through the agenda today, we'll go through some general updates. We'll talk about some proposed rules that have come out in the last 6 months with BIS. In addition, we'll get into some of the export control reform initiatives that have been proposed in the last 6 months, and then OFAC updates, really focusing on some of the changes that have happened with various embargoes or sanctions that are put out by the Treasury Department. The census updates will focus mainly on AES records and Schedule B changes, and then we'll talk about some of the major export enforcement cases that have happened in the last year. And we'll save some time at the end for questions, but as Don alluded to earlier, if you have any questions, please submit those through the question or the chat windows that are on the right-hand side of the panel. We'll be more than happy to answer the questions as we go through. Don will just interrupt me and we'll ask some of those questions, and I'll take some pauses after each one of the topics as well. So the topic one is the general updates. General updates, one of the main rules that have been proposed was in late November in regards to parts and components for ECCNs. So what the U.S. government has proposed is the new definitions of parts and components on various ECCNs. And one of the things I want to keep in mind is that these are proposed rules, so they have not changed yet. There's a series or a process that has to happen before these rules are actually finalized. They go through interagency reviews, and then they go through this proposed timeline, which is one of the things they do. They go out to industry. On the proposed rule, what they try to do is have industry review those and provide their comments back to the government on any issues that they see with the proposed rule. Then it goes back into interagency review again, and then it'll end up going to OMB, which is the Office of Management and Budget. They will look at it to determine what the constraints are or what the burden is on industry and the government, and then it goes through congressional action, and then it gets finalized in the Federal Register. So keep in mind, as we go through the proposed rules, these are not rules that have been implemented yet, but are for your information to take a look at, so that if you have any comments back to the government, then you have time to do that. We're going to talk about that a little bit later too. The parts and components on the CCL, what they've done is some additional references to parts and components. So there are ECCNs on the Commerce Control List that do not have the words parts and components into it. So they've added that. So where you may have a commodity that falls under a certain ECCN, now they've added in the terms parts and components. So those parts and components that are designed for that product, and there's some definitions that we'll go through, are now controlled under that ECCN. It also extends parts and components that were previously in the ECCN where only one of those words is referenced. So if only components was listed in the heading of that ECCN, now they've added the word parts, and vice versa. Parts, then now they've added components. In addition to that, they've added some ECCNs that are just for parts and components. So one of the things you have to look at is that if it's referenced before the subparagraphs, the parts and components are listed out. So what that means is if the part and component is, let's say, a screw, it will have a subparagraph that says screws, whereas the other two would be any parts and components. So you have to really read those headings to determine whether or not it's all parts and components or just the parts and components that are listed within that ECCN. And we have some examples to show you. On this proposed rule, if you want to send your comments into BIS, it needs to be back by January 28th, 2013. There is a list of 24 ECCNs that have changed under this proposed rule. You'll see just about every category is covered except for category 0. There are some major components or electronic sections, telecommunications sections that have been added with the words parts and components. So what you'll want to do is if your items fall into one of these ECCNs, you'll want to check and see if your electronics or if your parts and components for the products that fall under these ECCNs are now controlled. And really what you want to look at are parts and components that are really specially designed for those parts or for those products that fall under those ECCNs. Let's talk about what those definitions are. One of the examples here is I pulled out ECCN 5A991. The .G is the subparagraph. Today, the way that the ECCN reads is that it's mobile communications equipment, not elsewhere specified. That's what the NES stands for, and assemblies and components therefore. The proposed rule changes it to add parts in there. It changes the assemblies to read electronic assemblies and components therefore. One of the things I want to point out is that anytime you see words that are in quotes, that means that there is a definition within the Export Administration Regulations. There's a section 772 to the EAR that lists out words with their definitions, or you might find the definitions in the ECCN heading or in the notes section within that ECCN. So just keep in mind that anytime you see those quotes that there is a definition for those items. So what are the definitions? So in the proposed rule, parts is any single unassembled element of a component, accessory, or attachment which is not normally subject to disassembly without the destruction or the impairment of design use. So really what that's saying is that you're looking at parts that are designed for that product. Some of the examples that they published in the proposed rule are things like threaded fasteners, so your screws and your bolts and your nuts, rivets, and then other common hardware like washers and spacers and insulators. What that means is it's not those items that you would get from your local home improvement store like Home Depot or Lowe's. What it is those things that are specially designed for that end item. And so when you look at things like electronics, a lot of times companies have to specially design a screw out of a certain material, or it may have a certain color coding to it. So if you're putting together a cell phone, you might have to have a certain length of a screw that you wouldn't normally buy in a store. It's something that was manufactured to a spec to fit that phone. And in that case, that would qualify as a part under this definition. The next definition is component. So components are any item that is useful only when used in conjunction with an end item. Components are commonly referred to as assemblies. So you'll see a lot of the ECCNs, there were assemblies in the headings. Keep in mind that components equals assemblies. So while they may have gotten rid of assemblies, and they did not do that in that example that we have, but in a lot of the ECCNs, they did get rid of the word assemblies and put in components. So keep in mind that they're one and the same. They've divided the components up into two different components, major components and minor components. So the major components are going to be assembled element, which forms an end item without which the end item is inoperable. So these would be things like your printed circuit boards for an item. It could even be your chassis with some of the electronics on there. So there's different things, an assembly that you may have that you may manufacture for somebody else, or it could be an item that is manufactured overseas that you bring in and then assemble together. So keep in mind it can just be an assembly in most pieces. The minor component includes any assembled element of a major component, and that kind of goes with parts. So there's not a lot of difference between what they say is a component or a part, but you can have some minor assemblies that then goes into a major component, which then is all assembled together to make the end item. An example that we have here in 5A991.G for components, this is a picture of a speaker for a cell phone, one of those outdated cell phones, but nonetheless the speaker itself would probably qualify as a component, or would qualify for a component if that speaker is not used in other items other than telecommunications or cellular communication or mobile communication. The earpiece here with the speaker in it would also be considered probably an assembly under the definitions. Other example of assembly, so this is kind of the broken up phone. Each one of these things, like the printed circuit board, would be considered an assembly. You could have the dial pad as part of the assembly. The antenna is probably considered a component. You can have your LCD as well as a part or a component of the product. So when you take a look at your products, what you need to do is look at all the parts and components of your products. If you have a repair service that you do for your customers, this is what's going to be affected. If you're sending out parts for repair or warranty, you really need to take a look at those individual parts and classify those accordingly to the end item. So this is something that's kind of new to the regulations, and something that you may want to take a look at is see if your ECCN changes and why would it change. So if you're previously classifying something as EAR 99 and now it comes into this ECCN, let's say 5A991, you may not have been classifying your parts correctly in the first place. So you really want to take a look at all those parts and components and make sure that you're qualifying them in the right ECCN and assigning the right ECCN to those products. The next general update for 2012 from the Commerce Department is on voluntary self-disclosure. So this was published in November 7th. Once again, this is a proposed rule. One of the things that the State Department is saying is that The final narrative account of a voluntary disclosure must be submitted within 180 days. So what this means is that a lot of companies will submit a letter to BIS with a violation or a suspected violation on the voluntary disclosures. And generally they do that so that export enforcement doesn't start investigating and then they lose their chance of mitigating the fines. So they want to get those disclosures in before a formal investigation starts, because then they lose that mitigating instance. And on those first notifications, they don't always put everything into those letters, such as the corrective actions, the full value, all of the export violations. So if you know that you've been shipping something out or you've classified something incorrectly and you've been shipping it out and you know it needed a license because the ECCN was wrong, so it never got the license, you may need some time to do some investigation on all the different transactions on that part. What this allows you to do is that once you make that submission into the Commerce Department that you have this violation, then you have 180 days to complete your investigation and what your corrective actions are within 180 days. What's been happening is that people will submit those letters and not finalize their voluntary disclosures for 6 or 9 months. And really what they're trying to do is speed this up and be in line with what the State Department does as well. So this is kind of an export control reform as well. They're just trying to get everything in line like they do at the State Department. Now, if you need more time than the 180 days, you can ask for an extension, but the 180-day extension is going to be determined by the Director of Office of Export Enforcement. So it's up to them to decide whether or not they will give you that extension. And so I'll stop and ask Don, is there any questions so far on the first 2 proposed rules?
Well, Marcy, there is one question that we received, so I'll read it to you. It says, if I want to send a response for one of the proposed rules regarding one of my products, for instance, the parts and components of the Category 11 rules, and how the change will affect my company's products, what should I be sending in?
So if you're looking at, and we'll wait for the Category 11 for when we get to the export reform, but as far as the proposed rules with parts and components, really what you need to do is if it affects your company to the point where you have products now that would be controlled that previously weren't controlled, you need to send in something to BIS that explains how it would make a hardship to your company. So before a license was required, now one is. What is the value to your company? So how does it affect your sales? You will also need to provide technical information. So you almost look at it as if it was a classification request where you would provide information on the product, the end use of the product, drawings and specifications of those parts and components, and explain your case as to why you don't believe that that product should be part of those parts and components. The other thing is you may want to look at the definitions. If you don't agree with the definitions, the other thing is to provide suggestive changes or suggestive language that they can use if you don't like the language that they have. And that's what a lot of companies will do. The other thing is if you have some concerns, a lot of companies join different associations that will submit on behalf of the association, so you may want to check into those different associations to see if they're going to submit anything to BIS in regards to the proposed rule if you don't want your company name. So there's quite a few different ways to do that. If you would like us to take a look at it, we can always take a look at whatever you're going to submit as well.
Marcy, just a quick follow-on question to that. Does any of that ever do any good in your experience? Do they listen to the business community and change things?
They do. They do take a look at all of the comments, and they do publish the comments. When the final rule comes around, they will publish what people have sent in and then what their response is to those comments. And I have seen regulations changed as far as definitions, because that can be pretty tricky with the definitions. It can put things in control and not in control. And so they do take it pretty serious, and they will look at those. So what you really want to do is an analysis of the company to make sure that your company can comply with these regulations and that there's not a huge burden. Okay.
Okay, those are all the questions for right now.
Okay, thank you. So the next topic is export control reform. So we've done a lot on export control reform. There was a lot of information that was published in the last year. They did a lot of information on this in the BIS update, and we went through a lot of this in our August presentation. So if you do want to take a look at more detail on the export control reform, you can take a look at our slides from August. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but really focus on those proposed rule changes that have happened over the last 6 months. This is one of the slides that we did have in that presentation, just to kind of reiterate what BIS is looking at. So export control reform is far from complete, but the end of the massive list review exercise is in sight. So one of the things that they're doing is taking a look at every single category in the USML and reviewing it with the State Department and other agencies to look at which parts and components that they can move over to the commerce list. So what are those things that the U.S. government's not so concerned with? One of the things that will happen is they move those parts and components over to the commerce list, is that the policy will not change in respect to China and some of the other arms embargo countries like Russia and Venezuela. So keep in mind that while they are moving these things over to commerce, you will still have licensing requirements for those countries, and it'll be a policy of denial to those countries for those 600 items. One of the things that they're trying to look at with the 600 series is to provide parts and components to the U.S. ally countries, so the NATO plus the other additional countries like Japan and Australia and New Zealand, with parts and components of defense items that they've already been approved to receive. So if Australia has already received approval from the U.S. government to receive an F-35, it doesn't make sense that we won't send them parts and components. So I don't know why that keeps coming up, guys. While we want some parts and components to help them repair those items or any of those consumable parts that they need to be repaired on those planes. You end up having to wait another 6 weeks to 8 weeks for another license for parts and components. So what this does is it eases that burden and allows things to ship to those countries under license exception STA. Now STA was published, and it is in the regulations today. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on STA, but if you're not using it, take a look at it. STA was there in reality to help with some of these 600 series parts and components as they do this export control reform. One of the other things that BIS is trying to do is harmonize the penalties among the agencies. So it'll look at $1 million per violation or incident to 20 years maximum of jail time. So the same thing with DDTC. They're trying to harmonize those penalties. It'll be $1 million to 20 years in prison. With this export reform initiative, it estimates that 50% of the state licenses that are submitted today would move over to the Commerce Department under this export control reform initiative. Of that 50%, 30% of those should be eligible for STA. So what they're looking at doing is that 13,000 licenses would be eliminated that are being submitted today. So that frees up a lot of time for the Commerce Department, and then also hopefully eases the burden on the industry. However, what I will say is if you've looked at STA, one of the things that you're going to have to deal with are some burdens such as reporting requirements. The other thing that you have to look at with export control reform is how is that going to play an issue with your systems that you have today. So a lot of companies have automated export compliance systems that are hooked up with their ERP systems that do things like classification databases, license determination databases, and they want to get some of those comments in to see how much of a burden it's going to be and the cost that companies are going to deal with if they change this export control reform. So they're going to try to keep it so that you can keep some of the functionality that you have, but those are a lot of the comments that the State Department and the Commerce Department are looking for today. So moving on to what is really part of the export control reform is the 4 singles. So what they're trying to get to is a single control list. So it will be tiered. So while the USML doesn't really go away, it'll be a lot like what Canada has today, where, or even the Wassenaar arrangement, where you have a section that's for arms control. And then you'll have the commerce control list underneath that. So it'll be these different tiers. So really the USML will be one tier, and then the commerce control list is another tier. So you don't really go away from defense versus dual use. It's just that it'll be one list and you won't have 2 separate sets of regulations. There'll be one single licensing agency. So you'll go to that agency, whether it's a defense item and you're trying to get a license or whether it's a dual use item. They'll go to one single IT system. So that'll do away with D-Trade for the State Department licenses and SnapWire for the commerce licenses. They're not sure if they're going to use one of those systems or if they're going to invent a whole new one at this point in time. The other thing is that they're going to go to one single agency for export enforcement. So today you have Customs who helps enforce the State Department, OFAC, and some of the other regulatory agencies, and you have export enforcement that deals with BIS, as well as the FBI gets involved on those cases. They're looking at moving that all over to one agency, and it's looking like it's going to be Customs that will be that agency at this point in time. So your Office of Export Enforcement from BIS will now be Customs officials, will be Customs agents. And the reason why they're doing that is because Customs have so many agents, and they're right there on the border at all of the different ports. So it makes sense really for Customs to take that on, and they're already, once again, the enforcement agency for many of the other regulations that are out there, like FCC and FDA from an import perspective. So they can just add this on to their bandwidth here. So what is the reform process? So when it all started, it was identifying the items, going through draft proposed rules. I'm not going to read through each one of these, but where we are here is it hasn't moved since the August presentation. We're still in 5, 6, and 7, review public comments. So they have published a few more rules, so we're still kind of in 4 as they're publishing the rules, and now they're reviewing the public comments. So they've just published a few more rules, and we'll go into that mainly on Category 11. And then they'll draft those final rules. Then they have to give clearance again. So we talked about the BIS, what happens. They go through another interagency review. So that means DOD, the State Department, the Commerce Department, they all get together and review those final draft rules. And then they end up going into OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, and they once again look to see what the burden would be on industry as well as the government. Then it goes into Congress and the presidential decision, and then they'll publish the rule. And how they publish the rule is through the Federal Register. So you're still looking at many months away for this to be finalized. Some of the updates, so there was a new rule proposed for specially designed that was published in June of 2012. I'm not going to go into a lot of details in regards to specially designed. We did go through that in the August presentation, but if you haven't seen that, there is a definition in regards to specially designed, which is different than what you see in the regulations today under the USML. So specially designed would be both for ITAR products as well as commerce products, and it talks about what does it mean by specially designed. One of the other updates is that there's the category rewrites that were on hold for a while in the Office of Management and Budget since September have moved forward. That was the rumor, and the rumor's true because they just published the electronic section, which is category 11 of the USML. You'll see some of these other categories published here probably in the next few months. So if you are involved in any of the USML categories, manufacturing or procuring or brokering or any of those activities with any of these categories, keep your eyes out on those changes to those proposed rules. The main proposed rule we'll go through is the electronic section, which is category 11. I want to go into a lot of detail as to this because I think a lot of people fall into this particular category. This was one of those catch-all categories, the electronic section. So for parts and components, the computers fell into this, radar systems, communication systems, reconnaissance systems, a whole bunch of different things fell into the electronic section of the USML. So this was one of those big ones, along with the aircraft rule that was published back in November of 2011. So if you read this through and you want to take a look at the comments and you want to make a comment back to the State Department, then you do need to get your comments in by January 28, 2013. So they always give you about 2 months to review the proposed rule and send it back. The scope of the proposed rule, once again, is to add these items to the 600 series of the Commerce Control List. So moving some of those items that were in the catch-all area of Category 11 and putting them into 600. So one of the things that was different between the Commerce List and the USML list is that the Commerce List has various categories. They don't match up with the USML categories. So when you look at the 600 series that is in Category 11 of the USML, it could go into 3 different categories in the Commerce Control List. What they've decided to do is just add all of those things into Category 3 under the Commerce Control List. And I know that sounds, it's confusing, but kind of take a look at it as if you have a part and component that's for a communication system that was in Category 11, it technically could fall into Category 5, Part 1 of the Commerce Control List. But instead of breaking all those up, they're adding them all into Category 3, so just to confuse things more. So you won't find a 600 series for 4, 5, and 6 for those electronic components. You have to go to Category 3. And the proposed ECCN is 3A611. Now, you'll see I put an X up here, 3X661. That X is kind of this chart below. If you're familiar with the Commerce Control List, you know that the A is hardware, the B is production and test equipment, D is software, and E is technology. What you'll see missing here is C, which is materials. Well, they don't have anything that's materials that falls into this particular ECCN. Generally, if you're going to have some materials for electronics, such as things like beryllium or gallium arsenide, those are already in the Commerce Control List, and you may have to find those in a different category, such as Category 2 or Category 3. So you'll have to just take a look at those different sections if you're dealing with materials. Now, the 6X series, except for the .Y, is controlled for national security reasons, regional stability, anti-terrorism, and United Nations embargo. What does that mean to you? Basically, those are all the countries except for the NATO countries and the ally countries. So if you look at the STA country list, it's those countries. If you look at the Commerce Control country chart with the columns, then you'll see if there's an X in the box in those columns, then you'll need a license. So basically, I think the UK is one of those things where it is not on here. So you just take a look at those. If it's a .Y, it's only controlled for anti-terrorism reasons, and we'll talk about what the .X and the .Ys are here in a few. But the AT1 controls are only controlled to the terrorist countries, or the T5 countries is what we call them. That's the Cuba, Iran, North Korea, Sudan, and Syria. So if your items are listed in 3X661, and this is what I would tell you to pay attention to when you're looking at the proposed rules, is because then you're able to ship those parts anywhere in the world except those 5 countries. So take a look at those and see if you can try to get your items into that. Anything that falls into the 3B661, there is not a .Y paragraph. So unfortunately for the production and test equipment, in this proposed rule, there is nothing that can go for the AT1 controls only. So I've broken this down. I'll tell you that not the entire text is in here, just for the fact of not having a 100-page presentation. So do take a look at the proposed rule, and we can send that out with the slides so that you can see what the proposed rules are. But the paragraphs here are the subparagraphs. So when you look up an ECCN in the Commerce Control List, you'll have that ECCN 3A661. The .A would be the first paragraph under that ECCN. And you'll see here that this is kind of a catch-all, but it's not. Pay attention to this first word where it says electronic equipment and items and systems specially designed for military use that are enumerated in either a USML category or another 600 series ECCN. So it's kind of tricky there as to, okay, well, what do you mean? This is kind of a catch-all for electronic equipment, so keep in mind what electronic equipment is. That could be radar systems, but it depends on what it is. So they can list in this .A, this is one of the things you want to go look at, are the specific electronic equipment and items that they list out. B is electronic systems or equipment specially designed for the collection, surveillance, monitoring, exploitation of electromagnetic spectrum. What you don't find in here is reconnaissance. Okay, so they took everything else out and have thrown that over to the Commerce Control List, which is kind of a big win for a lot of companies, but the reconnaissance is still in the USML. Microwave monolithic integrated circuits and mimic power amplifiers based in journal or on four parameters. And if you look at the proposed rule, it'll tell you what those four parameters are. The .D paragraph, discrete radio frequency transistors. I'm not going to read each one of these one by one, but it just gives you an idea as to what has changed. You'll also see that there are some things that are covered in other ECCNs. So when you're dealing with some of these things like these radio frequency transistors, your items may fall into two separate categories or different ECCNs within the Commerce Control List. E is the high-frequency surface wave radar capable of tracking maritime surface targets or low altitude airborne targets. F, microelectronic devices or printed circuit boards not otherwise controlled on the USML that are certified to be trusted device from a defense microelectronics activity accredited supplier. This is kind of a big win for a lot of the contract manufacturers that are dealing with printed circuit boards for various customers. So you may be able to find out that those products fall into .F. Now, the .X and the .Y is something that's been in every one of the proposed rules. The .X is really the catch-all. So you don't see much of a difference between the .X and the .A. So as I take a look, this .A has the word electronic in it, whereas the .X does not. So if your items do not fall into any of excuse me, any of those other paragraphs, it's probably going to fall into .X, and you're going to be subject to those other regulations. So that's kind of that other, the H's or the parts and components section of the USML has now been changed over to the .X on all of these proposed regulations. The .Y is one of the things that you want to pay particular attention to. This is where companies have either written in or a lot of licenses have been granted and the State Department and the Commerce Department reviewed, and these are the items that they have looked at and said we don't care about it. And so remember, the .Y can go anywhere except for the AT1 or the terrorist 5 countries. So really what you want to try to do is, if you are a company that manufactures certain parts and components that you don't feel should be controlled, one of the ways to do that is to get it put on to this list. Now, one of the things that happens is that people say, well, I don't want to have to do this proposed rule and put all this information. I don't have time. The holidays are coming up, so we'll just write a CJ later. The issue with your CJ is that the CJ and the determination through the CJ will not be published into this into these rules. So you will have to wait for another rewrite if your item comes in to put it into the .X. What that means is that your item will probably be put into the .X category if they say it's not a State Department controlled item. So what does that mean? That means that you still have to get licenses for a majority of the countries except for those that qualify for license exception STA. So if you want to get your item into a .Y and only have controls to the terrorist 5 countries, you need to do it now and get the information in to the proposed changes. And so that kind of comes back to the question that Don had asked. We talked about the parts and components. What about the proposed rule for Category 11? what you'll need to do is, once again, provide a lot of specifics on the product. What are the end uses for it? Who are your customers to date? Who are your proposed customers? What does it mean to your company? Where can these items be used if they're used? If they were originally designed for military applications, but now you're selling them a lot to commercial off the shelf, and I see a lot of this in the aircraft industry, where these parts were originally designed for military aircraft, but due to the high temperature type products, they're also used in the automobile industry, the civil automobile industry. And so those are the types of things that you want to explain to the State Department to get your items moved over to this list. Now you can see there's all different kinds of things within this list that people were getting licenses for. And if you see your things in here and you haven't been getting licenses for, that's another issue. But so you've got everything from electrical fans to electrical connectors, back shells, joysticks, trackballs, and so forth and so on. So I'll let you read the list. But all of these are listed in that .y. So once again, if you want to get your item listed into .y, or you believe it should be in .y and it shouldn't have these controls, you need to get that into the proposed, into the State Department under this proposed rule. So I'll stop there and see if there's any questions so far.
Marcy, we did get another question. It isn't specifically in what you just talked about, but I think we can just bring it up now. It reads, if I previously classified a part of for a product as EAR 99, and now this part is captured under the proposed changes for parts and components, and now falls under one of the ECCNs listed in the proposed rule, what should I do, or what does this mean to my company?
So one of the things I have to look at with some of these proposed changes, a lot of people are finding out that they've misclassified, and that's really what it boils down to, is that you've probably misclassified your parts. There's a couple of things that you can do. One, you can either send it a CJ or a commodity classification request if you believe it's a commerce item, get a CCATS and get a formal review on that. If it comes back to where you have misclassified the items, then you need to go back and look at doing a voluntary disclosure and seeing if you need to really do one, talking with your internal and external counsel. So it may result into a violation if you have misclassified an item and then going that route. So sometimes this kind of wakes us up as to really what is the correct classification of our products. It may not be EAR 99. You may have classified it incorrectly. So you have to go back and take a look at the regulations to see if you did incorrectly classify the item in the first place.
Okay, that's the only other question that I have right now.
Okay, thanks, Don. Moving on to topic 3 in the OFAC updates, so talking about the different embargoes that have changed. There have actually been quite a few changes and updates to the OFAC regulations. I'm only going to focus on some of the major ones that have happened. The first one that most of us probably know about, it's been in the news, is the relaxation of the Burma, Myanmar sanctions. We'll go through that in more detail. And then general licenses for South Sudan. So while that really happened in 2011, I think that it's something that we do need to talk about. They have published some more information and FAQs on this particular sanction on South Sudan, or Sudan, and the lifting of some of the regulations on South Sudan. And then it's the significant expansion of Iran and Syrian sanctions on sensitive technology. So the Burma sanction, as most of you know, there's been quite some visits to Burma by the president, as well as some changes to the regulations. Previously, under the regulations, U.S. persons were prohibited from doing any kind of new investments, dealing with any financial services or any of the banks or loans, anything to deal with Burma, or even sending money to Burma or companies in Burma, dealing with letters of credits and that type of thing. In addition to that, we were not allowed to import anything from Burma, just like Cuba, where you can't import Cuban cigars. You couldn't import items from Burma as well. And then, of course, specially designated nationals that were put on that list, mainly some of the Burmese government agencies, military agencies, or companies and government officials were on that specially designated nationals list. In 2012, in particular July 11th, they did relax the sanctions. You are now able to do new investments into Burma. However, you still have restrictions on any dealings with the military or the Ministry of Defense or anything that's owned by the Ministry of Defense or state or non-state. So any government-owned items or entities that are 50% owned or greater, then you're still not allowed to participate or sell or provide funding or do dealings with those entities. They still have the sanctions on the specially designated nationals. They have not removed anybody from that list as to date. However, that could change. And you still have reporting requirements to the State Department when you're dealing with any of those general licenses. There are financial services permitted, so as stated before, generally those OFAC regulations or their embargoes really deal with the money and the transaction of money. You can now provide money to the banks in Burma. However, the issue with this is that most of the Burmese banks are specially designated nationals, so it's still very, very difficult to do anything in Burma today because any of the letters of credit are usually backed up by the Burmese banks, and if you need to pay someone, if you're purchasing something from Burma, then you need to pay, or if you need to get paid from a Burmese customer, you're usually going to deal with those Burmese banks. So that's the difficulty right now until they remove some of those banks from the specially designated nationals list. And the issue with that is that a lot of those banks are owned by the government, so it's kind of that catch-22. However, you still can import products of Burma. The only issue is that there are certain rubies and jadites that you cannot bring in under the regulations. Hey, Don, I hear typing.
Okay.
So licensing requirements for exports and re-exports of controlled U.S. origin items and non-U.S. items with more than 25% controlled U.S. content to Burma. So this is still a lot like the sanctions with Iran. So if you do have anything that's 25% or more U.S. content, you cannot export to those entities. The next sanction that's been updated is Sudan and South Sudan. So over the course of a couple of years here, the regime that's going on is the split between Sudan and South Sudan. Newly independent South Sudan removed from sanctions on July 9, 2011. So there is a new general license for South Sudan for exports of petroleum and petrochemical industries into South Sudan, and you can also do transshipments to and from South Sudan of those items. So kind of keep that in mind that it doesn't lift everything from Sudan, but it does allow you to do some things to help the economy in South Sudan using some of those general licenses. But there still continues the full sanction on Sudan of U.S. persons. So virtually all transactions by U.S. persons are prohibited, including the facilitation and exports of Sudan. So this, once again, this goes back to the OFAC regulations. While the EAR will allow you to send some EAR 99 items to Sudan, the OFAC regulations won't let you deal with certain entities. And there's still the blocking of the government of Sudan. So one of the things that you deal with of Sudan is who are you dealing with? So this goes back to the screening that you have within your company of checking your end users to ensure that you're not dealing with a government agency in Sudan, because most of those entities are also on the specially designated nationals list, but you can't just rely on the specially designated nationals. You really got to do your investigation. Don, I'll stop there and see if there's any questions on the embargoes at this point in time.
No new questions on that, Marcy.
Okay, then we'll move on to census updates. There's not a lot of updates with census. They've been keeping quiet, probably waiting for AES changes with the export control reform. However, if you haven't had a chance to look at AES lately, they do have a new feature, which is the shipment manager. This is one of those things that they've promised for years, and it's been out for a while, but I thought it warranted someone to take a look at it. Under this is one of those things that the Census Department has promised, is that you'd be able to get your reports of your AES transactions. If you're using AES Direct, and even AES PC Link, but more on AES Direct is really where this screenshot comes from, is the Shipment Manager, where you're able to pull reports up. You can pull reports up based on who the USPPI is, who the end customer is, countries, and even commodities. So there's different ports that you can pull up. In addition to that, this Shipment Manager is where you would go in to update shipments. So if you need to change the port of export or an export date or values or quantities, this is where you would go to update your shipments. And it's a lot easier than it used to be. You used to have to go in and wait, and it was just horrible to go find something. Now you have a way to retrieve a shipment. It'll bring up shipments based on the date. You can do the date range, you can do today's dates, last date. It can go by the transaction number. So you have many ways of pulling a shipment up to update it. Same thing with deleting the shipments. You're able to delete the shipments from the section. So it's a pretty useful tool. One of the things I want to point out to you is, though, to do this is where you would submit it. So if you as a company are submitting your shipments through AES Direct or through PC Link or through your ERP system to AES, you would be able to pull up those reports that you've submitted. If you have a freight forwarder that's submitting your AES records on your behalf, you won't be able to pull it up in AES Direct because it's on their account number, so their PIN and password. However, your freight forwarder should be able to pull up the reports for you to give you the information that you need. So keep that in mind. However, sometimes your freight forwarders will charge you for that, but there's some room for negotiation. So I just wanted to put that out there so that people know that there is a way to get those reports. And those reports become handy for lots of reasons. A lot of people will use those reports to do internal audits on their AES records to make sure that the correct licenses are being used, the correct classifications are being used. So there's quite a few different things that you would want to do for those reports. So that is available to you now through that Shipment Manager tool. The next thing I want to point out is the 2012 HTS update. So we're in December. If you haven't updated your Schedule B list by now, you might be in a little bit of trouble. But to keep that in mind, every 5 years, the U.S. government publishes a new harmonized tariff schedule. So remember, the Schedule B and the harmonized tariff schedule kind of go hand in hand with each other. If you attended the last seminar, you can see what the differences are and what the similarities are. So there was a major change in 2012. The next major change will be in 2017, or I think it's every 4 years ago, because the last one was 2007. Sorry about that. Or 5 years, yeah, 2017. They have published those changes on their website, so if you want to see the Schedule B codes that are no longer valid, you can go to this link here and it'll give you a PDF of all of those sites. Now, one of the things you want to keep in mind is as we're getting into 2013, you may have changes again. So what happens on those years in between the 5 years is the U.S. can update the Schedule B or HTS codes at any point in time, and usually it's just the statistical changes, so the last 4 numbers to the HTS code. Those still can change, so you want to take a look at those and see if there's any Schedule Bs that can change. Now the issue here is that those changes may come out in January. Sometimes they come out in February, so you just kind of have to keep posted. Take a look at the Census website. I know they try to publish them on January 1st, but they go hand in hand with the HTS code changes, which usually take longer for customs to get through because they're dealing with the duty rates and anti-dumping and everything else that goes along with HTS codes. So it may not be until February when those are published. But keep an eye out. The Federal Register will come out, and once we know too, we'll send out some notes to the customers on our list. So just make sure you keep that up to date on the Census website. Going into topic 5, the next thing I'd like to go through are some of the major enforcement cases for 2012. Let me tell you, it seems like the activity is getting more and more on these enforcement cases. There's been quite a few that have been published lately. They did say that they were increasing the investigations and enforcement, but keep in mind, some of these cases as we go through them, while they were just published or finalized this year, these investigations can go on for 5 years. So you'll see that some of the dates of when these things happen may have been 5 or 6 years ago, and now it's just finally going. So as you can imagine, being involved in one of these cases is not it's not very cheap to the company and can be very time-consuming for the employee. So as we go through the different penalties that some of these companies have received, not only are they receiving the fines and penalties, but you also have to think about the lawyer fees that these companies have gone through and the time and effort of their employees and the costs that go behind that, and then getting the records. Sometimes you have to pay freight forwarders and customs brokers to get you the records on top of it. So, as we go through the fines and penalties, keep in mind of how much these costs can keep piling up on top of each other. So the big one that was out this year was a division of Pratt & Whitney. The Pratt & Whitney Canada pled guilty to export controls for exporting military software to China, which allowed China to develop their first modern military helicopter, the Z-10. And one of the things that's unique about this case, well, I guess it's not really too unique, but one of the things that came out is that the executive management for Pratt & Whitney said, okay, well, how much can we be fined, and how much does this mean to the company? So it was said that this particular deal was worth about $1 billion to Pratt & Whitney, and as you go through the fines, you'll see the fines are only $75 million. So you do the math. One of the things I've seen in a lot of articles that have been published out there is that some of the senators or congressmen are saying that they didn't, that the export enforcement did not charge enough in the fines, and are looking to go back and see if they can increase the fines because they don't think it sent a big enough message with the $75 million fine for export violations, because if it's a $1 billion investment, $75 million is not really that much for the $1 billion for the company. Some of the charges in this case was, of course, violating the Arms Export Control Act, so exporting illegal helicopter defense articles to China without a license, also making false statements on the export documentation. So once again, if you have an AES record, then they didn't put the right information on there, excuse me, on there, that's a violation. And then the other thing, excuse me, is failure to timely inform the U.S. government of the exports. So you do have a requirement to tell the State Department, excuse me, pardon me, a little frog in the throat. One of your, yes.
Marcy?
Uh-huh.
No, it's interesting that you bring this issue up, because I was this morning looking through the State Department, and they have some clarifications out about this as to exactly who you can work with and who you can't work with. And it became clear that the exceptions that they've made, I don't know if that's the right term, to this really are specifically things that if companies stopped working with Pratt & Whitney Canada, would hurt national security. So government, government projects and things of that nature, people can still go ahead with them. So that shows you, in this case, that national security trumps what they would do otherwise, because Pratt, of course, is involved in a lot of, particularly with the helicopters and aircraft, a lot of products which are critical to national defense.
No, you're absolutely right, Don. And that's one of the things they look at when they're doing the fines. And so I think this is why the Congress and some of the senators and congressmen are coming back and saying, well, we don't think that's a big enough fine and you need to look back at it, because they don't think it sends a big enough message to the national security. So you're absolutely right. So what did they end up doing to Pratt & Whitney in the fines is that it was a $75.7 million fine. $55 million of that is payable to the State Department. 20.7 was payable to the Department of Justice, and then $20 million of it is suspended if they spend that on an internal compliance program. And you'll see this a lot in many of the cases, is that the government will suspend some of the fines if they can show that they've spent that money to upgrade their compliance program. And that can be done in many ways. That could be hiring individuals, that can be investing in automated systems like ERP systems, these compliance licensing systems, training programs. It can also be things like material that you publish out to your folks for the employees. So there's lots of different things that you can do to put that $20 million to. Of course, they do have to sign off on it. One of the other big things that you see with the State Department cases, especially of this kind of nature, is that they will make the company hire an independent monitor to assess the compliance program. So really, the company has to pay this person's salary. They are on site, and I've seen this at a few different companies I've worked for in the past. They will come on, they will do internal audits of the compliance program, they will monitor the procedures that go on, they'll take part of it, and they really become part of the compliance program. And so this is another fine if you look at it, because of all of the things that you have to do. You have to pay for the person's salary and all of their items and any travel that they may have to do. If you've got different divisions all over the country or all over the world, you're going to pay for them to go back and forth. So that's an additional cost to it. In addition to that, Pratt & Whitney Canada was added to the debarred list. So you might say, well, hey, I do business with Pratt & Whitney all the time in Canada. I'm a repair vendor, or I make helicopters, or I make aircraft that we purchase those products from all the time. And what does that mean to me? Well, there are some exceptions to that debarred list for Pratt & Whitney. What they are saying is that if you are exporting to the U.S. military or to the U.S. allies that will be using these products, then Pratt & Whitney can still export to those. But they are looking at all of the exports for Pratt & Whitney. So if you're trying to get a hold of someone in that department, which I can tell you that I've tried in the last few months, is very difficult to find somebody because I think they're very, very busy. The next enforcement case deals with an OFAC violation by the Delphin Group. They're located in South Carolina, and they're in the business of making automotive and marine lubricants, and they were selling them domestically and internationally. Well, what had happened is that the manager of the company knew that they were getting involved in prohibited transactions. So once again, this is kind of like the Pratt & Whitney case, where they knew that they weren't allowed to do business with Iran, and they went ahead and did business with them anyway. And so the charges that they received is conspiracy to violate the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or the IEPA, as well as making false statements in connection with the illegal exports. And once again, this is falsifying your export documentation, your AES records, your commercial invoices, and those types of things. While this case was just prosecuted, they have not sentenced the individual yet. However, what he does face is 5 years for conspiring to violate the IEPA, or the export regulations. He will also have 20 years in prison for violating the IEPA and 5 years in prison for false statements. So that's up to a potential of 30 years in prison. In addition to that, $1 million for each IEPA account to the company for those violations. The next enforcement case deals with a conspiracy, and it was a pretty elaborate conspiracy, and you'll see this quite a bit. And this is one of those instances where I tell companies, where they ask me, Marcy, should I be screening my domestic sales? And this is a clear picture of why, yes, you should be screening your domestic customers. This was a procurement network that was set up with the Russian military firm. It dealt with a company that was based in Texas, and it was really a front company that was set up to sell electronics to a Russian entity, who then resold to the Russian military and intelligence agencies. And this particular company shipped almost $50 million worth of products to the Russian military and intelligence agencies. And you'll see a lot of this, particularly these types of networks and set up procurement agencies for China, Russia, in some of the other countries, really a lot of the Asian countries, where they're trying to re-export these products to countries that aren't allowed to have it. So a lot of the arms embargoed countries will have these networks set up, and they're companies within the U.S. So you really need to do an investigation on some of your customers and look at it. And I'll tell you, one of the best things you can do is look up their address on Google Maps and see if it's a house. If it's a house, you might want to start questioning it, or if it's a residence, because generally that's telling you it's not a legitimate business. They're just there to buy the products and then resend them to something. So take a look at your customers and their business backgrounds, and even do Dun & Bradstreet backgrounds to get their history. And this is the reason why. So what were the charges in this particular case with ARC Electronics? The export of technology sensitive goods to Russia without the required export license and falsifying documentation, so just like the others. The potential penalties, so this was guilty, but they haven't done the sentencing yet. With this one, here's what the possible penalties that they can receive is 20 years in prison for conspiracy to commit money laundering. So they keep adding and trumping up the charges to get more fines and penalties. 10 years for acting as an unregistered agent of the Russian government, and fines up to $500,000 for the conspiracy account, and fines up to $1 million for each of the substantial IEPA and AECA or arms export control counts. So there's quite a few fines and penalties that can happen under this export enforcement case. To kind of go through, so those were like 3 of the major cases that have been published. There's been quite a few other cases. If you want to look through those, all of these cases were published in the Federal Register. You can go to the BIS export enforcement page. They have PDFs of these different cases, and you just take a look if you want to get more details on each one of these cases. I think the State Department as well published these, but you can even Google, and I'm sure you can find different articles that are out there on these different cases. Kind of going back through what was given to us at Update this year is just some of the facts as to what's happened over the last year. And mainly these are the 2011. Of course, they don't have the 2012 figures yet. Once we get those, we'll provide those to you as well. But for the fiscal year 2011, BIS convicted 29 individuals of violations resulting in 572 months of imprisonment. Also, they received $20.2 million in criminal fines and $8.5 million in civil fines. Well, this year is going to trump that, because we know just the Pratt & Whitney case alone was $75 million. So there are some additional fees and penalties that will be there. In 2011, BIS issued 227 warning letters. So this is something, when you get a warning letter, this is something that BIS has responded to, either a voluntary disclosure or they have found something. Generally, it's through something from a disgruntled employee, or through something that was submitted in AES that they found that was incorrect, or something that competitor has said, and they've done an investigation, they've sent you some warnings. Out of the voluntary disclosures, only 3% resulted in penalties. So that's kind of, I get the question a lot, well, if I do a voluntary disclosure, what's the chances of me getting a fine and penalty? Well, here you go, it's 3%. And what I've always told people is it really just depends on what the violation is. So really, if you've seen what these enforcement cases are, these are people that knew it was wrong, and they were things going back to what we talked about earlier with Dawn, with national security concerns. So does it detriment the national security of the U.S.? In the case, if it is, then you're going to see the fines and penalties that come up. If you have things like administrative errors, or like expiring licenses and you exported under the expiring license, or you went over the quantity, or you wrote down the wrong license exception on your AES record, those are things that are administrative penalties, and you most likely will not get a penalty. But if it's something that occurs and reoccurs and reoccurs and reoccurs all the time, then you may be looking at a penalty. And I'll tell you, there was another company I worked for, and even though this isn't a U.S., it was the Canadian government. They issued a fine to this company because they were tired of seeing the export documentation being incorrect. They were sending letters, warning letters over and over again to the company, and they never got it fixed. So they ended up with a fine of $1 million just because they were tired of seeing the errors on the documentation. So you got to take a look. If you're not correcting those errors, then you probably will get a penalty. BIS is focusing a lot on individuals versus companies. So a lot of people, what they're seeing in these cases, are acting on their own while their company has a compliance program in place. They're realizing that these individuals are taking it upon themselves to make the sale, to get their bonuses or whatever it may be in violation of the company's policies and procedures. Doesn't mean that the company's cleared, but they are still looking at individuals. So there's some certain things that you do have to put in place, and things like auditing and internal audits that you would go back and take a look at, and even automation of some of your ERP systems that could stop a shipment from going. So if a person clearly takes a box that's sitting on the side and your shipping department won't ship it out, when that person takes their time and goes out, gets the box and ships it off to the local FedEx office, the company is probably not going to be fined in that particular case. They'll be focusing on the individual. And BIS realizes that individual people may go and violate their own company policies and procedures to get what they want done. So they are looking at that. BIS is also targeting illegal procurement networks with a focus on IEDs. So if you did attend the BIS update, there was a soldier that they had at the BIS update that talked about being in an IED explosive that killed some of his troops, and he was severely injured in that particular IED explosive as well. What they found out with those IEDs is that a lot of the components in those IEDs are coming from U.S. manufacturers. And it's really that the manufacturers of those semiconductors and processors and things of that nature aren't selling directly to these entities, but there's this elaborate network of selling and reselling and reselling and reselling that ends up getting into the hands of these terrorists that are making these IEDs. And so what BIS is targeting these procurement networks. And I'll tell you, I've seen it from a couple of companies that I've worked for that are in those industries, is that BIS, the FBI, will call up and ask for information on a particular transaction and ask for your records. And that doesn't mean they're targeting you, but they want to ask you to help in those investigations. And so they will ask for the transactions, and they will say, okay, call us up if this individual wants to purchase some more products from you. Then let us know, and we'll target it. Let us know when you ship it. Give us the tracking number. We'll meet up with them, and then that's how they're catching some of these individuals. So just because the FBI is calling you doesn't necessarily mean you're under investigation, but they're asking you also to help with some of this. So they are targeting those networks, realizing that U.S. companies are really trying to do the right thing, and that your customer may be lying to you about who you are, and you've done your tracking, you've done your Dun & Bradstreet, you have an end user certificate on file, you've done a screening, and everything checks out, but that individual still may be part of that procurement network. So those are the types of things that are going on. The next thing here is enhanced enforcement, and this kind of goes back to the export control regime of some of the things that will be going on with the export control regime. Enhanced outreach efforts to companies who are affected by the transition. So export enforcement is going to do a lot of outreach programs, a lot of training in the different cities where they have export enforcement offices, which is just about every major port that's out there. They're going to work with Census to ensure changes to AES. So as they go through this export reform, all of these systems have to be changed, and AES is one of them. So if you're not familiar with AES, that's the automated export system, and it's the required record that needs to be submitted on any exports that require a license or Schedule Bs that are over $2,500 for Schedule B. It's a requirement, and Customs and Export Enforcement uses AES to look at different transactions. I can tell you one of the companies I used to work for, they had their freight forwarder submitting their AES records for them, and one of the things that they were doing is submitting IR on their paperwork for the items that were going to Ireland. So those who are familiar with the ISO codes, IR is the acronym for Iran and not Ireland. So I can tell you we had a little visit from the FBI that came in hand with copies of the AES records and said, what are you guys doing sending stuff to Iran? And they realized it because the ship to address was really location in Dublin. So they realized it was really going to Ireland and not Iran, but said, go get this fixed. So that's one of the things that you have to take a look at is that Census it works with these enforcement agencies, and so they really do look at those AES records. More information to licensing officers regarding the foreign parties they see on licenses. So one of the things that they're doing are a lot of these on-site visits to your customers, those post-shipment verifications. So once you get the license, a lot of license providers that are coming from BIS will say they're going to do a post-shipment verification, which means that your customer has to allow BIS to come in and take a look at their facility, and to make sure that the items that they say, that the end use of the items that you're shipping to them really are the end use that they're using for it. So they'll take a look at this facility, make sure the manufacturing equipment is being used for the items. So if you're selling analog to digital converters that are supposed to be used in cable boxes, they want to make sure that they're manufacturing cable boxes at that location and not radar systems at that location. So they'll go and do those post-shipment verifications.
Marcy?
Yes.
Marcy?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, this is Don. Yeah, what you're saying here really underscores something which we've talked to a lot of our clients about, which is how critical good record keeping and organized records is. And we have a client that during the training, employee training, talked about that, and before you were talking about getting a call from the FBI or from the government, and they had a situation like that where they received a call and answered all the questions, and they said, oh, well, we're worried about you guys, we're worried about your customer. Now, we speculated, had they not had the information right there, who knows where they might have gone with that. So all of these kinds of things speak to the need to have really good records and to be very careful.
And you're absolutely right, because one of the things, a good rule of thumb, is that you're able to produce those records within 24 to 48 hours after the request. And sometimes they realize that if you are keeping hard copy documents and it's an off-site location, it can take a couple days to get that. But with all the electronic means, they are looking at companies to try to keep it electronically and send it. And that's my recommendation, is to try to keep it electronically as much as you can. But you do want to make sure you do have a good record keeping, like Don says, and that you have a log so that you can find that information quickly as well.
Yeah, because the longer it takes to produce something, that raises suspicions. You know, I worked for General Electric for many years, and when we would go to a supplier because we needed information, if it took them an overly long period of time, we always worried about that, saying, well, what are they doing? I mean, you know, this is not good. Are they falsifying records? So, you know, that timeliness is very important.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, because then while they're looking for you to help in an investigation, if you're taking a week or 2 weeks to get in the information, and that happens more than once, they can refer it over to the compliance division to start the investigation on your record keeping. And so that's some of the things you got to keep in mind as well. So as we go through this, some of the other things that they'll be focusing on as time goes on is the STA. So anybody that's using license exception STA, they're going to look at the end users and make sure that they're eligible for those components and parts. So make sure that you're following all those requirements under STA to ensure that they're eligible under that license exception. End use check for 600 series items being imported into ITAR controlled end items, incorporated into ITAR controlled end items. So you want to, as the reform goes on, this is one of the focuses that they'll be looking at. And once again, they're prioritizing enforcement on all illegal procurement networks for weapons of mass destruction, IED, and 600 series items. So as you look through all of this, there was a lot of focus on certain industries in the past, and generally it was the electronics industry. For a while there it was semiconductor manufacturers, but now they're looking at a lot of industries and not just the bigger companies. They are looking at mom and pop organization too. Medium-sized companies, small companies, everybody's in the mix. So they're not just focusing on those big companies, but they are looking at the smaller companies too. And in the case where they have some of these illegal procurement networks, they will put the companies out of business because they don't want them doing business. And those individuals will get jail time to ensure that they're not going to do this again. So that is the end for the presentation. Don, are there any questions at this point in time? One of the things I can tell you, if you do have any questions, make sure that you put those on the questions taskbar or in the comments taskbar, and we'll get to those as they come in.
Marcy, there is one that just came in, and it says, in regard to the procurement networks, what do you do when you are the manufacturer shipping to a U.S. distributor and they're the exporter of record? Are we responsible for getting an end user statement, or how could that come back on us if there were an issue to arise?
So if you're shipping to a distributor, one of the main things, you would not be the exporter of record. However, if you suspect that that distributor is involved in illegal activity, then you want to cease any domestic shipments to them. But one of the ways that a lot of companies deal with this is that they will put into their contract language information that states that that company will comply with the export regulations. And one of your responsibilities as an OEM is to make sure that that distributor is doing that. And I'll tell you, one of the companies I worked for, we worked directly with the distributors, worked with their compliance programs to find out what compliance systems they had in place to make sure that they had good compliance programs in place. And that takes some time, but if you're giving that distributor the ability, because a lot of these distributors don't have selling channels or to go outside the U.S., but if they do, you want to make sure that they are complying with regulations, and it takes time, but it can come back to you that you're kind of turning a blind eye if you know that this distributor is reselling outside the U.S. and they're not complying with the regulations. So you just do some investigation with those distributors. A lot of the big ones that are out there, especially the electronics distributors, have some good compliance programs in place. And you may even learn some stuff from them as well. I can tell you that we did when we went out and looked at some of these major distributors and found out using some of their best practices and incorporating them back into our own company. So you just want to make sure that you're covered, once again, with the contract language, and then to go back and audit to make sure they have those compliance programs in place. You're not safe by just putting language into a contract. It's not enough. You really should be looking at those companies. Okay.
Yeah, Marcy, this is Don again. We do have on the call some of our clients, and they will recognize the fact that when we worked with them, particularly with their sales group and also with their procurement group, that we propose a proactive communication in addition to contract language, which specifies to the customer or the supplier what the expectations are. And we think that's an additional protection for our clients and shows extremely good due diligence as well.
Go ahead, Don.
Here's another question. Should we show concern if our company has sold to any of the companies you just talked about who are involved in the violations, and are talking about Pratt & Whitney or ARC or any of the other ones that you mentioned?
Well, it depends. So if you're involved in one of those companies, once again, you need to take a look at what it is that you're involved with. So if it was before they were had the violations, you're actually kind of clear, but you may want to take a look and see if you have any notes that say that they were going to violate the regulations. So let's say if you're dealing with Pratt & Whitney and you were selling them component parts, and they said, and they did an NG certificate to you saying that those ITAR and products were going to end up in China, you could have some culpability there. But, you know, if they're not telling you that they're ending up in China, then there's not much you can do, and they told you that they're staying in Canada and they don't know where the end user is, then you really don't have a lot of culpability. Today, if you're dealing with Pratt & Whitney, and there's probably a lot of folks on the phone that probably deal with Pratt & Whitney and believe it is Pratt & Whitney Canada. It's not all of Pratt & Whitney, it's just the location, but I do know that there are folks that deal with Pratt & Whitney Canada. It's whether or not Pratt & Whitney can export those products. So it's not you, it's Pratt & Whitney. So Pratt & Whitney, if you're asking them to ship an engine to Russia, then they're not going to be able to do it. However, if you're shipping it to Russia, you want to make sure that you have the license. You're most likely be able to get that license to ship to Russia, but Pratt & Whitney will not be able to do it. So you have to look at how you have your contracts in place with Pratt & Whitney, and repair and warranty and replacement parts. All of those different things may affect your supply chain. So that's how you might want to engage. Those other two companies that were on there are no longer in business. So you shouldn't be dealing with those companies at all at this point in time. Anything else, Don?
Marcy, those are the questions, and we're about at our 90-minute time frame, so maybe we'll move on to the next slide. Okay, we asked the question at the beginning, the brain teaser. If you were 40 years old today, when would the next time the date repeat? The actual time that the next day would repeat would be January 1st, 2101, and therefore you would be 129 years old. And I'm happy to note that my friend Maureen Johnson from General Aluminum Forgings was the first person, and really the only person, to answer that correctly. So Maureen, good for you. And Maureen asked me when I sent her note and told her she got it right, she says, do I get $1 million? And I said, only if you win the amazing race. But Maureen, we do appreciate your participation, and of course appreciate working with you as well. So that concludes today's webinar. We thank you for participating. We hope this was helpful. Marcy, excellent job. Thank you for your work on this, and we will continue to try to provide the latest information to everyone in the industry who needs it. And of course, Marcy's numbers here, also the 800 number. If you have any export needs or import needs, Marcy and we have other people that know a lot about that. Give us a call and we'll be glad to help you. So that will end today's webinar, and hopefully we'll see you on February the 13th. Bye-bye.